Thank you. And I'll start just quickly with a mic check that everyone can hear me just fine. Please raise your hand in the back if you can't. Okay, great. Oh, yes. And please do remember to turn your cell phones down or off or on mute. Or else you'll have to share your conversation with everyone else in the room. Okay. So without further ado, I'll get started here, and I really do appreciate you hosting me here in this beautiful facility in the Linda Hall Library. I've not been before, and I look forward to exploring it during your meeting after this talk. And so I've come across the state, and I'm coming from the gateway to the west, St. Louis. I might get some tomatoes thrown at me back home, but I would suggest that from an ecological perspective, Kansas City is really more fittingly deserving of the moniker Gateway to the West because it's the gateway to the Great Plains and more arid western ecosystems, whereas St. Louis is really more in that transition between the eastern woodlands and the grasslands. So, no tomatoes in this room, okay. So, well, my career trajectory spans the border here. And so with that regionally, topically appropriate sentiment, I'm going to speak about not only rare plants, but imperiled grasslands, and specifically the North American tallgrass prairie, one of the most imperiled grassland systems in the world. But a little bit of background context for how I came to be connected with the Westport Garden Club. About 2 years ago, I was giving a lecture on the nuts and bolts of prairie restoration at Powell Gardens, and during that meeting, I met Kathy Gates, and we were talking about my work at the Missouri Botanical Garden. She referenced the Westport Garden Club's activity with sponsoring scholarship applications for Garden Club of America scholarships, and that then led to, a year later, the Westport Garden Club successfully sponsoring the application of Catherine Hu, who was a recipient of the Joan K. Hunt and Rachel M. Hunt Summer Scholarship in Field Botany, which she did at the Missouri Botanical Gardens Shaw Nature Reserve. She was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, completing her master's studies there. And she then went on to work at Forest Park Forever, where she still is today, working in their restoration and land stewardship, all of which came to fruition due to the support of Westport Garden Club, Shaw Nature Reserve, and our collective support of capacity building for the next generation of conservationists. So I really do appreciate your support, which continued with the next year, Angela American being the recipient, with support from the Westport Garden Club, of the first ever Montine M. Freeman Scholarship in Native Plant Studies, which she carried out at our Whitmire Wildflower Garden, a 7-acre botanical garden within the Nature Reserve dedicated entirely to native plant horticulture. And she focused on assessing threatened plants of our region to include in a new garden that we're looking to develop in the coming years focused on the display and interpretation and conservation of threatened plants in our region. So that then serves as a good starting off point for discussing what we mean by rare, threatened, imperiled. There's so many terms thrown around, and some have very precise regulatory meanings and others are more vague. For instance, rare is kind of inherently subjective. Some things are rarer than others, but there are governing bodies and biological organizations that ascribe clear definitions to what we mean with rarity. Internationally, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has a red list, and this is the global standard for defining rarity of organisms, not just plants, but all biological life on Earth. But as with the English Standard Unit of Measurements and the metric system, here in North America, we do things a little bit differently. So we look to NatureServe, and these two ranking systems do have a pretty clear crosswalk, fortunately. But NatureServe, which used to be associated with the Nature Conservancy, now an independent body that defines biological rarity based on some clear criteria, which I'll briefly discuss. And then importantly, this is a distinction between federally endangered and federally threatened. That is assigned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with a lengthy and detailed review process. Now, being federally endangered comes with the benefits of some regulatory teeth as well as funding for research, but because it is inherently a regulatory and politicized process, it can be slow to respond to the biological reality on the ground. These NatureServe rankings are purely a reflection of the biological reality on the ground. They have no regulatory teeth, but they can quickly adapt to the reality of rapidly declining rare populations. So then, a little bit of inside talk here. People talk about globally imperiled and globally extirpated, so these rankings. GX, presumed extinct, that means nobody's seen it for at least 50 years, and there have been really intensive efforts to find that species, and it has not been found. Then there's possibly extinct, which means nobody's seen it, but we really probably could try a little harder, and maybe there's a bit of hope that we'd find it. Then we get to critically imperiled, G1s in kind of botany wonk speak. These are plants that typically you think of fewer than 5 populations in the world. And to use a regional example, this is Sabbatia arkansana, Arkansas rose gentian, known from only 2 populations in central Arkansas, in the entire world. And people are oftentimes surprised to learn that there are new species to science being discovered in the Midwest, in Arkansas, even in Missouri. We think of this as something that's only happening in the Amazon. Surely we must know every plant in North America already. That's not true. We continue to further our understanding of rare plants, sometimes through genetic work, but also in other cases simply through the discovery of clearly morphologically different species that no botanist had ever seen before. Then we get to imperiled species. These are species that are usually in the kind of 5 to 20 population range. This is Arkansas waterleaf, neat little plant that occurs down in the Ouachita Mountains, so quite rare. And then we look at G3s. This is kind of the upper threshold of what we might consider to be rare plants, those that we would be focusing on for inclusion in the threatened plant garden that Angela American was focused on. And that these are species typically known from fewer than 80 populations globally. So still, that's quite rare if we think about it. Now, sometimes we can have our lens of rarity a little bit skewed by the popularity of plants in the horticultural trade. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing at all that these plants are planted in our gardens. That can increase awareness. But in terms of actual natural populations, in many cases, there are far more artificial populations than natural populations. And that would be the case with threadleaf blue star, Amsonia hubrichtii, which was named the 2011 Perennial Plant of the Year by the Perennial Plant Association. Stunning plant, so it's become fairly increasingly common in the horticultural trade, and yet in terms of actual natural populations, there are 50 or fewer remaining populations. And then we get, just jumping ahead to the globally common species, and this includes, that doesn't mean weedy, so I want to make that distinction. Here we have Sullivant's milkweed, blue wild indigo. I mean, those are not weedy species. They're indicative of high quality prairie habitats, and yet in terms of number of populations throughout North America, they're in no threat of extinction in the near future. And then you also have the globally common species, things like ragweed or eastern red cedar, that are arguably weedy and aggressive in their colonization of disturbed areas. So as we see here, the U.S. Endangered Species Act has a total of about 830 some species, whereas we're looking at 5,000 species in the United States that would have some biological basis for rarity. So there's clearly a gap there between those plants that are regulated by a governmental body versus those that are biologically rare. Now, let's jump into a few examples that Angela looked at for inclusion in our threatened plant garden, and we'll start very, very close to home. This is Dirca decipiens. It was discovered only back in the mid-2000s by Aaron Floden, who is now the curator of the flora of Missouri at the Missouri Botanical Garden. But once again, this theme of crossing back between Missouri and Kansas, he was at Kansas State at the time when he discovered the first known population of this species in Johnson County, Kansas. And it looks very similar to the more common eastern leatherwood, but is in fact genetically and morphologically distinct. And this picture, is actually of the eastern leatherwood, because I couldn't find any pictures of the rare species being used in horticulture, but they look very similar, and likewise have this nice round form and beautiful fall color. So spreading out a little bit further from home, we look at Alabama snow wreath. This is another one of the species that we're working with. Alabama snow wreath is, I would not say common in the horticulture trade, but certainly present. It has these really stunning flowers and creates a nice shrub form. It's very closely related to Japanese Caria, if some of you are familiar with that. And so it's a white-flowered North American relative of Japanese Caria. And it's extirpated from Missouri. It was known from only one population down in Butler County. And that's where I look at these rankings. G2, okay, so globally it's imperiled, but then that S ranking, that's at the state level, state historical. So Missouri it's very rare. And when we think about rarity, there are different scales of rarity. There are species that may be globally common, yet on the edge of their range are exceedingly rare. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore their conservation on the range edge. Range edges can oftentimes contain unique genetic adaptations and populations that are very much worth conserving. Sometimes people might be prone to think, oh, but that's really common further east. Why should we care if there's just one or two populations here in the Kansas or Missouri border? Well, we should, because it's important to maintain all that genetic diversity, which could become very important for adaptation to changing climates. So this species is in the trade, but to the best of our knowledge, all of those plants in the trade are the result of one single collection in northern Arkansas. It can be grown clonally very easily, so it's been divided and divided. And so that's lovely to have these plants in the garden. They're beautiful. You can interpret their rarity, but in terms of actual conservation of genetic material, it's not that meaningful. So we're looking to make collections from as many populations as we can throughout the range. There are only about 25 remaining in the wild, and then get them together and try to maintain that composite genetic diversity. Another example of a species that's quite rare from Missouri and federally threatened would be Virginia sneezeweed, which at the time in the late 80s it was named as federally threatened, was only known from Virginia, not West Virginia, but the western edge of Virginia, where it occurs in sinkhole ponds. And then after that, it was discovered in sinkhole ponds in southern Missouri. And then there were some intensive efforts to collect seed and then seed bank and establish new populations, a partnership of the Missouri Department of Conservation and Missouri Botanical Garden. And you see the new populations being established near some sinkhole ponds in the Ozarks. And at this point, there are now far more populations in Missouri than there are in Arkansas, and those reintroduced populations are doing quite well. And then this is a really interesting example. This is Claytonia arkansana. It was briefly known as Claytonia ozarkensis because it was thought there were some species, some populations rather, in southern Missouri that were later determined to just be kind of odd-looking variants of the widely spread Claytonia virginica, the typical spring beauty, which is a very common species. But this Claytonia arkansana occurs in a very different habitat than the moist woodland understory of spring beauties. It occurs in these rough, rocky slopes. And it's interesting because the seed, if it were to disperse down the slope into the moist coves beneath, that wouldn't be suitable habitat for its persistence. So what it does is really pretty remarkable. It has this adaptation that as the seeds mature, the fruits curve back and deposit the seed into these little crevices. So my colleague at the Botanical Garden did a study looking at this, and the really fancy term for it is negative phototropism. So moving away from sunlight rather than towards the sunlight. And so the flowers are moving towards the sunlight when they're exchanging pollen and out away from the cliff face. But once they've been fertilized, then they curve back and deposit their seed into the cliff face. And so as we develop this threatened plant garden, these few examples, I hope, demonstrate how each of these species has a story to tell, an interesting story, and we hope to provide a context in which we can not only demonstrate their horticultural beauty, but interpret the importance of their conservation and the work that the Missouri Botanical Garden and other conservation organizations throughout the region carry out, and inspire the next generation, gratuitous picture of my daughter there, and inspire the next generation to appreciate these plants, which is really what we're all about with our capacity building at the Nature Reserve. And so with that, I want to transition to imperiled plant communities or entire ecosystems, the tallgrass prairie region. And it's important to note that although some of the species pictured here are globally common, I mentioned the Sullivan's milkweed or the blue wild indigo. Those are indicators of high quality prairie and they're common species. But when we think of imperiled plant communities, the sum is often greater than the parts, right? And these plant communities as a composite are exceedingly rare. So I'm going to speak a bit about my own narrative of becoming appreciative of tallgrass prairie, because we need to really understand and appreciate our native plant communities in order to be champions for their conservation. And we each have our personal connection with that. And so I'll use my narrative to demonstrate some of the concepts and challenges of conservation of our threatened grasslands. Now let me back up here, this big word here, Anthropocene. So there are a lot of challenges of conserving tallgrass prairie in the Anthropocene. What is the Anthropocene? The Anthropocene is a term that has come to be used to define our current geologic era. So just as the Pleistocene was marked by repeated glacial cycles and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers and all that exciting cartoon animals and Ice Age that some of your grandchildren might be watching. My daughter likes it. So, just as that defined the Pleistocene, the Anthropocene is the geologic age in which human activity has become the dominant influence on our climate and our environment. The very essence of tallgrass prairie has long been shaped by humankind, though over the past century that relationship hasn't really been very kind to tallgrass prairie at all. A recent assessment of global ecosystems by the Nature Conservancy concluded that temperate grasslands are the most endangered and least protected habitat type on Earth. The tallgrass prairies of Missouri and Kansas are among the most threatened and rarest of all temperate grasslands globally. The tallgrass region you see here once covered about 400 million acres prior to Euro-American settlement, and less than 1% of this historical extent remains. In Missouri, pre-settlement prairie covered approximately 15 million acres, of which less than 60,000 acres, or 0.5% remains. So that's a pretty dramatic transition. And only a fraction of those remnants would be considered of high quality. When I say that they remain, that means they haven't been plowed or converted entirely to other land uses, but not all of these maintain a high ecological integrity and biological diversity. Some have been degraded through their land use. Given such losses, there might be an inclination to just say, what's the hope? Throw in the towel and let's move on from this nostalgic notion of bringing back this ecosystem that is clearly so greatly reduced in its abundance. But I would posit that we need to take the opposite approach, and that's not a quixotic, nostalgic sentiment. It's imperative that we conserve this biodiversity because of the great potential it has to aid in conservation moving forward. To make a parallel between cultural heritage, if only 1% of an ancient city were to remain, we wouldn't say, let's just forget about it, what's it worth? We'd call it a UNESCO World Heritage Site and put all the resources we can into conserving it, and I'd make the same argument for tallgrass prairie. That analogy is really helpful as we think about the conservation of our remnant prairies. The Missouri Prairie Foundation, the Department of Conservation in Missouri, Kansas, we have the Kansas Land Trust. We have some great organizations dedicated to conservation of these last remaining remnants, and they are not ruins, they are teeming with life. So here we see a highly diverse prairie. These plant communities are really remarkable and worth saving. And within them, we have many plant species, both common species or royal catchfly, which is another rare species that we would target for inclusion in our threatened plant garden. And not only rare plants, but rare insects, many of which are dependent upon larval host plants, such as the regal fritillary here, which is dependent upon the bird's foot violet for its larval host. And amphibians of conservation concern, and stunning grassland birds, which grassland birds are declining at more rapid rates than any other major group of birds in North America. So it's imperative that we conserve their habitat as well. So, as I've said, we each come to value conservation through our personal experiences, which shape our perspectives. So now I'm going to jump back into some of my connection to prairie and how I came to be interested in this topic, and then weave back in some of these examples to illustrate concepts of conservation challenges throughout the remainder of the talk. Specifically, I'll discuss the importance of understanding the historical ecological contexts that have shaped the prairie landscape and the challenges of applying this historical reference to a contemporary landscape that's being shaped by processes for which there really isn't a historical precedent, namely fragmentation as we dissect the habitat into smaller pieces, invasive species, which are a complete game changer, and then anthropogenic climate change. So we can't simply look to the past for guidance, but it's important that we look to the past for guidance to help us face contemporary conservation challenges. My interest in ecology really began with land stewardship. Pretty basic, applied, taking care of the family farm, removing cedars and multiflora roses on our land near Herman. And then we did a warm season grass planting through the Conservation Reserve Program of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. At the time, I referred to it as a prairie. It was only 4 grass species. I really didn't know any better. I thought that was a prairie. But then I started paying a little more attention to the prairie plantings at the nearby Shaw Nature Reserve and learned to realize that prairies are comprised of more than 4 grass species. They are highly diverse plant communities with a lot of wildflowers as well, and sedges, and all of these important components of diversity. So I bought myself a copy of the Tallgrass Prairie Restoration Handbook and still had the simplified idea that I was going to find the right recipe and make a better prairie. I'll cut to the chase. I learned it wasn't that simple, but we'll get there in time. So then, as a student at the University of Missouri, I visited Tucker Prairie, 140 acres, which is the last sizable remnant of the once expansive Grand Prairie region along the Grand River and its tributaries in central Missouri. And I was inspired by this diversity at Tucker Prairie. I got permission to collect seed, and that probably seemed like an odd question to the professor who was the steward of Tucker Prairie. So then he offered me employment to do work at Tucker Prairie, which really meant studying plant communities hunched over little plots, counting flowers and stems for hours and days and weeks and months on end, something I'd end up doing a lot of in the subsequent years. But during that time, I also got to know Pat Jones. I lived in her guest house at Prairie Fork Conservation Area, and it was really a privilege to become closely acquainted with Pat, who is one of our conservation heroes in the state of Missouri, and also for Tallgrass Prairie, and one of the more sincere, inquisitive, and humble people you'll ever meet. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Pat, you may also know of her husband, Ted, who passed in 1997. Ted, also known as Edward D. Jones Investments. And we can thank them not only for supporting a lot of land acquisition and conservation and the Prairie Foundation and all sorts of other great organizations, but also the Katy Trail, for which they were great champions of rails to trails. They met on a bike ride. Yeah. So after working at Tucker Prairie in the University of Missouri, I headed way out west to the University of Kansas. Okay, I'm in a Jayhawk-friendly crowd here. So I caught some flack for this move, as you might imagine, but I didn't go for the basketball. I did become a basketball fan over time, but I went for the prairie. Kansas, Toto, Little House on the Prairie, right? I mean, we think of Kansas and the prairies, but I went not to study Little House on the Prairie, but to study prairie restoration and plant community ecology, where I worked with Kelly Kincher and Brian Foster in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And I continued throughout my graduate work that obsession with trying to convert this low diversity warm season grass planting into a much more diverse prairie reconstruction. And my dissertation work focused precisely on that. At least components of my work focused on applied methods for combining different seeding rates and different disturbance regimes to try and enhance the diversity of low diversity prairie plantings. Throughout graduate school, I was essentially a non-traditional graduate student working as a botanist for the Kansas Biological Survey while doing the whole dissertation thing on the side. And I actually have to say I learned a lot more from those 7 years of applied conservation work than I did from toiling away on my dissertation, because this work as a botanist exposed me to a lot of different grassland systems and conservation issues. A few examples very close to home here. Over the course of 4 summers, I did botanical inventories of 7 counties, identifying the last remaining remnant prairies, and then doing what's called floristic inventories, which is the fancy word for identifying every single plant you can find and making a list of it. So it's really interesting work from a botanical perspective, and you also meet some characters along the way. And not everyone gives you permission to visit their property. I did always get permission. I didn't trespass. Met a lot of interesting people on the way. This person said no. But the overwhelming majority say yes. But I also had a really great field companion. Over the course of 4 summers, Maya and I inventoried 475 prairie remnants not previously documented by the Kansas Biological Survey. And we also found a lot of new populations of the federally threatened Mead's milkweed. And I do mean a lot, as in 133 newly discovered populations, some of which were really large, containing thousands of stems. But there were also some bad days. On several occasions, I inventoried highly diverse prairies that, including sites with Mead's milkweed that had been sprayed with broadleaf herbicide. Here you see the the tractor path through there, and the aftermath, you start to see the leaves curling and wilting. And so this is a misguided practice of the belief that this is improving the pasture and the forage value, which is not actually supported by science, but supported by outdated notions that these are merely weeds. They're not. They actually have a lot of nutritional value for the cattle and also make for great biological diversity in lands that can be used for grazing and haying as well. So it's important that we educate landowners very tactfully. And these losses underscore the importance, how critical it is that we conserve these last remaining remnants, and how important the work of the Kansas Land Trust, the Prairie Foundation, and the Department of Conservation is. And we have some great remnants not too terribly far from Kansas City. I'd be happy to talk to anyone one-on-one who wants suggestions of where to see some high-quality remnants. A little bit further afield, but still closer to home here, we have the Tallgrass National Preserve near Cottonwood Falls in Strong City, where I did the vegetation mapping, and I'll reference back later why this was insightful to learn about these large-scale, yet not so botanically diverse at a smaller scale plant communities. And then there's Homestead National Monument in Beatrice, Nebraska. If you say Beatrice, they'll know you're not from there, but they'll know you're not there from anyway, because they'd recognize you if you were, right? It's a small town. And so Beatrice, Nebraska is the site of the first ever homestead doled out under the Homestead Act, 160-acre parcel. And there's also a really great museum there, shaped like a prairie schooner. And importantly, from the context of prairie restoration and conservation, it is, to my knowledge, the site of the second oldest prairie restoration done in the United States, the oldest being Curtis Prairie at the University of Wisconsin. And they actually took chunks of sod. They scraped up sod from prairies that were being plowed and destroyed, and then transplanted these large pieces of sod into the prairie there. And you can still today, if you're a botanist who studies these things, make out pretty clearly which areas were transplanted with the intact sod versus those that were sown from seed. They're more diverse to this day. And then nearby, 9 Mile Prairie, this is hallowed ground for prairie ecology. John Weaver and his students worked there from 1915 to 1950 and studied the vascular root systems of prairie plants and a lot of early prairie ecology work just west of Lincoln. Also did a lot of work on Department of Defense sites. This might seem counterintuitive that DoD lands are important for conservation, but they are. If you think about it, and the DoD is one of, I believe, the fourth largest landholder in the United States, you can't have a bombing range immediately adjacent to a subdivision. There needs to be a considerable buffer. And even in these rural areas, you also can't have a bombing range adjacent to a cow pasture or farmhouse in a rural area either. You simply need a sizable buffer. And as a federal agency, the DoD is mandated to maintain these intact natural communities and any rare plants that occur on them, and to manage them for biodiversity, and they do. And so I did a number of botanical inventories of these DoD lands. It's just really important to maintain contact with range control so that you know when the next strafing run is coming, and to watch out for unexploded ordnances. I'm not actually kidding. You'd have to check in every 2 hours and, okay, now it's time to go to sector Kilo 39 and get out of where you're at. But a lot of interesting plant communities that are being conserved there. Meanwhile, as I was collecting seed of less common prairie plants, growing them in a greenhouse at the University of Kansas, and then transplanting them back on that farm in Herman so that I could develop seed amplification plots to continue trying to enhance the diversity of that prairie planting. Somewhere in there, amidst all these side projects of horticultural interest, I managed to finish that dissertation, but I stuck around Kansas for another year or two working on a postdoc with a collaborative project with the Department of Medicinal Chemistry, in which we were assessing the chemical qualities of medicinal plants throughout the Great Plains. So this exposed me to a number of other regions further afield in the Great Plains. This is the Cimarron Grasslands, about 9.5-hour drive from here near Elkhart, Kansas, extreme southwestern corner of the state. Very different. As I said, Kansas City is very much the gateway to these expansive western landscapes. And the Nebraska sandhills, which were a topic of our conversation last night, I'm not on the payroll of the Nebraska Department of Tourism, but if you haven't explored the sandhills, you really need to. They're exquisite. And also contain the largest concentration of populations of the federally threatened western fringed prairie orchid, really stunning species, photographed here in Valentine National Wildlife Refuge. And then here we get to the extreme western Nebraska panhandle, Wyoming border in the background, the short grass prairies near the state line. So we collected a lot of plants for analysis. My favorite collection was this bush morning glory. These are beautiful bushes that occur in these sandy habitats further west in the Great Plains, starting kind of Smoky Hills and west from there. And they're really deep roots. They're not the root was the part of medicinal interest, so after this photo, my colleague put down the camera and held my ankles, seriously, but so that I didn't just get swallowed by the earth alive. But then I merged with the root, which continues, can't quite make out the thin taproot there. And then subsequently, I came across this photo of a kindred spirit from nearly 100 years prior, posing with a specimen of bush morning glory. And as exciting as that was, it was a much less adventurous collection that led to the star plant of the study. And that was Physalis longifolia, common ground cherry. Really was actually quite easy to dig the roots and fruits out of the sandy soil. And this plant is the species that led to the most exciting discoveries, these beta-withanolides, these novel anti-cancer compounds about which there continue to be publications to this day and active research assessing the anti-cancer properties of this species. And I bring this example, the argument that we need to conserve nature because we never know which plant might contain the cure to cancer is used so often that it almost becomes trite, but it also happens to be true that we really don't know much about the chemical qualities of these plants, and it is a valid justification among many others for their conservation. So after 7-8 years in the Great Plains, I was finally starting to feel at home and taking in some of the cultural sites as well, such as Carhenge near Alliance, Nebraska, which I visited several times. The world's largest ball of twine, Cawker City, highly recommend it. World's largest pheasant in Huron, South Dakota, and it goes on from there. But then an opportunity for a more permanent position came up closer to home at the Missouri Botanical Garden. So I returned to Missouri. I'm from outside of St. Louis, and I worked with the Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development for 7 years, focused on conservation of rare plants in the Mid-South and the Southeastern U.S., seed banking, germination ecology, all sorts of manipulative experiments, trying to figure out how to manage the habitat within which these rare plants occur. And this was really helpful in providing me a broader context to the conservation issues faced throughout our region, as there are imperiled grasslands into the southeastern U.S. as well. Some of the more interesting species we worked with, at least close to this area, this is the smallest one we work with in Missouri or anywhere. Tiny Tim is one name for it. It's Mononuria minima, and it's this diminutive little fruit. That's a finger. That's the whole plant. And then this is the seed using a penny for scale. It's pretty common in photographs to use a penny for scale, but not typically by putting the seeds on the penny under a microscope. So this is a seriously diminutive plant that occurs only in some of our higher quality prairies with these sandstone outcrops. And then as we get to the southeastern U.S., Tennessee coneflower, this is a real success story. It was federally endangered and then downlisted to threatened and then delisted altogether through successful efforts of collaboration between the Missouri Botanical Garden and Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation to reintroduce and manage populations of this species, which is absolutely stunning as a horticultural plant as well. It's really maintains a more diminutive size than some of the other echinaceas and really fantastic. So many of these species I worked with in the Mid-South are disjunct remnants of ancient populations that spread further east. So there was a period about 5,000 to 9,000 years ago called the Holocene climatic optimum, or the hypsothermal. Big word either way, but the point is 5,000 to 9,000 years ago, it was a much warmer, drier time, and the flora of the Great Plains extended much further east. And so as a result, you have these common rare couplets of the western common species that at one time extended further east, but then when the climate cooled again, the Great Plain grasslands retreated further to the west, and these populations were isolated on these rocky glades that provided arid conditions despite the greater humidity further east. And over many thousands of years of genetic isolation, they then evolved into completely new species. So here we see the prairie turnip and then the Nashville breadroot and milk vetch, common milk vetch, and then Pines ground plum, similar but different. And then the tall, pale pink coneflower, and then the Tennessee coneflower, related but genetically distinct and completely novel species that evolved over time. Working in these communities really provided exposure to a lot of different habitats. These dots represent, each one represents a population of some of the rare species that we work with. So this exposure to diverse ideas was really helpful as I stepped into my new role over a year ago as director of the Nature Reserve, which includes over 75 acres of remnant intact glade natural communities. Glades are rocky openings in our wooded landscape. And here you see the glade coneflower, which is restricted to these glades in eastern Missouri with some disjunct populations in Tennessee as well. Just really stunning. I think these were still blooming around the time that the Westport Garden Club visited the Nature Reserve. The Nature Reserve has played a pretty critical role in prairie conservation in Missouri, which is really remarkable given that there actually are no remnant tallgrass prairies at the Nature Reserve. However, back in 1979, the first prairie planting began, 40 acres with support from the Department of Conservation and the Prairie Foundation. And over time, those prairie plantings have become more numerous and more diverse, and we now have over 300 acres of reconstructed prairie that provide really important habitat for all variety of insect life and wildlife and grassland birds. And I also want to point out that once an original prairie has been broken, we don't know how to put all the pieces back together. The prairie plantings at the Nature Reserve are not original remnant prairies or prairie reconstructions, and they have not achieved the diversity of our highest quality intact prairie remnants. In some regards, the most important function, one of the most important functions of these prairie plantings is that they expose over 70,000 visitors annually to the concept of prairie and inspiring them to value the cultural and natural heritage of the tallgrass region. And we see the impact that this has on how it shapes people's lives and careers. This is Bill David, who was a naturalist at the Nature Reserve with his daughters. Carol David, who went on to be the executive director of the Prairie Foundation, grew up at Shaw Nature Reserve. So case in point that how we interact with the natural world when we're young really impacts our role in valuing conservation as we grow older. So as I'm beginning this new chapter at the Nature Reserve, there's plenty of challenges I face. So what do? When we face challenges, we look for references of what's being done right elsewhere, and we also look to our lessons from the past. And the same can be said of ecological restoration. So that same reasoning applies to restoration of degraded prairies and the management and stewardship of high-quality ecosystems. So restoration ecologists also look to contemporary references of intact natural communities to try and figure out what should we be trying to restore. Contemporary references are generally really high-quality remnant prairies like those I've mentioned that are being conserved. And so when we're trying to do restoration, that might be our target. But we don't just look to contemporary examples. We also need to look to the past for guidance about what the different ecological processes are that shape the tallgrass prairie. We know we can't recreate the past, but I think this Malagasy proverb is a pretty good analogy for restoration and for conservation, in that we must simultaneously look to the past and the future in order to make informed management in the present. So what are the primary ecological forces that have shaped the temperate grasslands in North America and our tallgrass prairie? Well, climate, clearly. Both extremes of rainfall and drought have been major forces shaping tallgrass prairie. And herbivory, and I use the word herbivory rather than just grazing. Clearly, bison and elk had a major impact in shaping tallgrass prairie, but herbivory, bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? Herbivory happens at smaller scales as well, with mammalian herbivory and, importantly, insect herbivory. We see bison on the landscape or cattle, and we can clearly see the impact of their herbivory. But in terms of the total amount of biomass converted from plant material to other substances, insects play a major role and are major shapers of grassland communities. If you remove insects from the equation, it completely alters which species are dominant and completely alters the system. And then the third force, climate, herbivory, and fire. Fire is really important. Perhaps the first thing that comes to mind when we think of prairies, the very existence of tallgrass prairie is dependent on fire. And humans have been lighting fire in the tallgrass prairie since the last glaciers retreated and Native Americans settled the Great Plains about 10,000 years ago, and they managed their landscape. And a number of early Euro-American settlers documented the frequency of fire and the impact that the decline of that frequency had on the transition of the prairie communities. As an interesting side note, it's worth noting that when we had the transcontinental railroad and the expansion of railroads into the western U.S., it's believed there was briefly actually an uptick in the frequency of fire due to all the spikes, the sparks, and the little sparks of burning coal that would have started prairie fires with great frequency near the railroad tracks. And they would have carried for a great distance because it was not such a fragmented landscape that would stop the fire. In the absence of fire or other modern surrogate disturbances such as haying, we know that tallgrass prairies are rapidly encroached upon by trees because the tallgrass is far enough east in the US that there's adequate precipitation for woodlands to grow. It's disturbance, namely fire, that keeps tallgrass prairie from turning into woodlands. That's not so true once you get out to the shortgrass prairie. There's simply so little rainfall that even in the absence of fire, which was a natural process there, but even in the absence of fire, there's not enough rainfall to support woodlands. But as we look to the past for fire frequency, we can't necessarily look to historical precedents for what frequency of burning we should do now. So we refer to this as fire frequency, fire return interval. How often should we burn? And we know that in our fragmented landscape, woody encroachment, that transition to more wooded shrub habitats happens at a much more accelerated pace for a few reasons. One, in this fragmented landscape, the distance between a prairie and the nearby seed source of woody species is very little, oftentimes just across the fence row or across the gravel road, whereas historically in an expansive prairie landscape, those seeds would have had to travel a long distance to colonize that prairie. So that greatly accelerates the rate of woody encroachment, conversion from grasslands to shrublands. And then also, we know there's a global phenomena in which elevated CO2 levels are increasing the pace of woody encroachment in grassland systems globally. So what do we do about that to continue to conserve prairie? The initial response might say, oh, well, we just need to burn more often to keep the shrubs away. Maybe we need to burn every year. Well, that presents its own challenge because there are many prairie obligate insects like this regal fritillary that are completely dependent upon some unburned refugia within the prairie for their larval food plants, and they overwinter in stems, not the regal fritillary, but other insects overwinter in stems of unburned grass material. So this presents a real challenge. You can't just burn the entirety of a small prairie. Historically, when fire was happening on a vast landscape, due to changes in moisture and topography, there naturally would be some refugia that were unburned, so that would provide places for recolonization. But contemporary prairie managers working on larger scales really need to wrestle with some of these challenging decisions. Another simple thought exercise that I like to use to illustrate the distinction between, the disconnection really, between historical references and the contemporary landscape is let's imagine we go back in time, let's say 500 years ago, prairie was entirely intact. The John Deere hadn't introduced the steel plow until 1837. It's not for centuries to come. But let's assume we bring a plow and some seed corn back with us and we plant a cornfield or any row crop field in the middle of this prairie, and we grow crops for a while and then we abandon it. So what would happen? What would happen to this abandoned crop field? Well, there's really only one possibility. It would revert back to prairie. The plant community composition might be different, the soil structure would be altered, but we have 100 acres of corn in the middle of tens of millions of acres of tallgrass prairie. The only seeds that could possibly recolonize this disturbed former cropland are prairie plants. Well, that is clearly not the case in our contemporary fragmented landscape. And we know now that if you take a remnant prairie, plow it, and then abandon it, it does not revert to prairie. Rather, it will become an old field with cedars and honey locust, or very likely become completely rife with invasive species from the surrounding landscape, which by definition, these exotic invasive species weren't present in North America prior to introduction, typically intentional introduction. So clearly this is an example of how we can't just look to the past for guidance because past processes don't play out the same way in our contemporary landscape. And on the topic of invasive species, which as I said are a real game changer, it's worth noting that the ranges of plants have always been dynamic, shifting and contracting and expanding over the millennia. Looking at that example I referenced of all those plants from the Great Plains that went to the southeast. So this has always been shifting, but the pace, the rapid introduction of species across barriers they couldn't possibly overcome without human assistance, that's entirely unprecedented. And in North American tallgrass prairies, some of our worst invasive species are legumes, things in the bean family with really hard seeds, then long-lived seed banks, and that are not at all controlled by fire. Perhaps the worst in our area would be Chinese bush clover, Sericea lespedeza, and it responds positively to fire, which represents a real challenge. And so this completely changed. Oh, and what's more, it takes a persistent effort over decades to eradicate these populations once established, but they can still be purchased in 50-pound sacks. So we still have a pretty major disconnect between what the conservation community is doing and some of the forage production there. So also looking at a difference between, we talk about climate. Okay, so climate, historical climate as not being an analog for our contemporary climate. These are some maps that a colleague of mine at the Botanical Garden who does climate modeling, looking at running buffalo clover made. And the black dots are populations, both historic and some still exist, and then the little clouds are the climatic niche. So if we look ahead in time, these populations in Kentucky don't look like they're going to be in very good shape, at least if climate is the only factor controlling their populations. And then if we go to 2080, we really see very little suitable climate even in Missouri. And if you zoom out, you see that the suitable climate is all the way up in Canada. So what are we supposed to do about this? Another challenge is the rate and direction of climate change is so unprecedented. As I said, climates have always changed, but never at this pace. And so then a question arises, how quickly do plants need to disperse in order to keep up with their optimal climate? This is called climate change velocity. And the quick answer is that they can't disperse quickly enough, especially for long-lived perennials. Their lifespan takes too much time. Seeds don't disperse enough to keep up with the pace of climate change and track that through natural dispersal. And that's without even taking into account that the intervening habitat between impact tallgrass prairie remnant A and B is unsuitable habitat across which they can't disperse. So that's a real conundrum. What do you do about that? In response to that, there has been a conceptual discussion among ecologists about an idea still considered somewhat radical, but increasingly commonly discussed, that is assisted migration. The idea that we might actually need to go take plants and move them into where their suitable habitat will be in terms of climate, or that in order to ensure that our prairies are resilient to climate change, we should start getting seed from points further southeast. So perhaps we should, as doing a prairie planting, have, as this study suggested, a portion of the seed of butterfly milkweed should be from Texas to try to get some of those genetics that are more adapted to these dry conditions integrated in our prairie conservation, our prairie plantings. So I'm in the camp that says, well, not so fast. First off, logistically, that's pretty much impossible to take on large-scale projects to get seed from further south and start introducing it into our new prairies. But also, to do that would ignore that where plants occur now in their current climate is not necessarily indicative of the climatic conditions that they can tolerate. And so this is a basic concept, and you take an ecology class, Ecology 101, you're going to learn about the realized versus fundamental niche. The short of it is that the realized niche is where you do grow if you're a plant. The fundamental niche is where you could grow if you were exposed to those conditions. And to use a horticultural example, we know that there is not a one-to-one relationship between where a plant does grow and can grow. Look at invasive species, but also thinking of a native species. This is the native range of bald cypress with that broken line indicating the northern limit of the southern pond cypress. You can't quite make that out, but still, there's the, I think this is falling off, sorry about that. So that's the native range of bald cypress, and so it's a much more southern species, but we know that it actually occurs and can grow all the way up into more northern zones, all the way up into zone 4. Actually. So that's a long way north of where bald cypress naturally occurs. So clearly its fundamental niche and its realized niche are very different in terms of climate. And we learned from the drought of 2012, as depicted by this contrast between a native warm season grass and non-native cool season grass, that our native prairies are remarkably drought tolerant. So from a practical stance, I think that the best thing we can do to anticipate these changes in climate is to manage our prairies to maintain the maximum diversity of the plant species that occur there. And by doing so, we increase the likelihood that a large number of those species will be able to tolerate and continue to thrive under warmer and drier conditions. Among conservation scientists, climate change really isn't all that controversial, but it might be surprising to some of you that a more controversial subject among prairie conservationists in the Missouri, Kansas area in recent years has actually been the role of grazing in remnants. And we know from romanticized paintings that bison were really important on the prairie. And if you look at these paintings, you'd think they were pretty much omnipresent. But we do know that they're migratory, and at any given time, their impact on a given location might have been more ephemeral. Bison herds were large and they came through, and they may not have returned to graze a specific location for many years to come. They weren't fenced in. But I don't want to exaggerate or diminish the influence of these large grazers, but we also don't have a historical precedence for knowing what the frequency and intensity of bison grazing is and how we should apply that. From these artistic depictions, we know that there's a fair bit of exaggeration, but we also know that bison were really important. I joked a bit tongue-in-cheek about the car henge and ball of twine and so on, but I actually did visit some important cultural sites out in the Great Plains, such as the Hudson-Mang bison fossil kill beds, which are really interesting up in northwestern Nebraska. And so we know that Native Americans were reliant upon bison, and bison were occurring in very large numbers dating back 10,000 years ago and have shaped the tallgrass prairie for a long time. Some scholars would suggest that hunting by Native Americans moderated bison populations, and there's even some evidence that because disease introduced by Euro-Americans resulted in a decrease of Native American populations, that resulted in a real spike in the bison populations, so that then disease got further west before the Euro-Americans did. So then when Euro-Americans first came and documented the bison abundance, they were seeing a really amplified abundance due to the decrease in the Native American population. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, and I'll leave that to historical scholars to think about what the historical abundance and impact of bison was. But as with the other examples, I would say the more important question is, what is the role of grazing on the contemporary landscape? Even if we knew precisely what the right formula is for grazing impacts of bison historically, we know that doesn't necessarily translate to what do we as land managers need to do in the contemporary landscape. So when, where, and how do we use grazing as a tool for management? And so that is a question that we're still working to answer. There are concepts like patch burn grazing, and with small portions of a prairie are burned, the cows tend to graze more intensively on the recently burned grassland, and so then this creates a mosaic of habitat structure. At this point, there's been a lot of research from further west in the Great Plains demonstrating that this patch burn grazing approach can really enhance bird habitat for important animals such as our prairie chickens, and that this can even enhance the botanical diversity as well, but big caveat there, enhancing botanical diversity relative to baseline conditions of some more degraded western grasslands. I mentioned earlier that I did the vegetation mapping for the National Park Service of Tallgrass National Monument, and although if you were to look at that 10,000 some acres, you'd see a really large species list. If you put a 1 meter square plot down in any one place, it's not that botanically diverse. It has a long history of intensive grazing prior to being protected as public land. So it's providing important large-scale landscape habitat for grassland birds, but not the best botanical diversity on a small scale. So there's been a lot of concern among some in the prairie conservation community about what impact using grazing as a tool will have, and there's still a lot to be determined as we look at grazing on some of our more diverse, high-quality remnants, but there are studies underway and some sound research being done. And so long-term research has been initiated to determine, and time will tell. So let's keep an open mind and see how this plays out on some of our remnants. But I do want to point out that, one second. It's important to note that our grassland birds that are declining, they require these large-scale habitats. But unlike grassland insects or some of our high-quality plants that are dependent on really high-quality intact habitat, grassland birds really need more structure. So they're pretty happy in an open brome field as long as there aren't any trees for predators around. So expansive grasslands that provide habitat for prairie chickens aren't necessarily an indicator of the composite integrity of insect diversity and plant diversity. So there have been some who've suggested that these small prairie remnants that can't provide habitat for grassland birds are somehow less important, as though they're prairie gardens because they can't support birds. But conversely, we have these large-scale habitats that don't conserve plants. So here we see La Petite Gemme, 37 acres in size, yet it has 335 native prairie species. And I'd suggest this is more than just a prairie garden. It's providing habitat for prairie mole crickets, which are these very rare threatened little crickets, and also just a tremendous diversity of plants. So to suggest that this is just a prairie garden suggests that somehow it's of lesser value. And I think we need to be careful with that idea. These are very much real prairies. And this is very much a real prairie as well. But just to make an analogy, I think it would be silly to suggest that because this doesn't have the insect or botanical diversity, but it can support birds, that it's a prairie zoo. That kind of is degrading, insulting to the value of this large intact landscape. We have a place for both large intact landscapes that are not as botanically diverse and small remnants that are highly diverse. Optimally, we have a combination of both, but both pieces, the small diverse remnants and large degraded remnants, are really important for conservation of different organisms, both flora and fauna. So conservation and stewardship of prairie remnants with exceptional ecological integrity, regardless of size, is critically important. And yet, as I've emphasized, conservation in the modern fragmented landscape is really challenging. And with that, I have one last topic that I want to discuss, and that is that in response to these grave challenges, I mean, it's overwhelming, all the different challenges we have in grassland conservation. There are some academic ecologists, activists, and environmental writers who begin to promote a new paradigm known as novel ecosystems, a new way that we think about our interaction with nature. The basic premise is reasonable enough, and that is that contemporary ecosystems are fundamentally different from those that prevailed historically, and that we must accept this reality. I can't really disagree with that. There are just certain changes that we have to accept. But within the umbrella of this novel ecosystems paradigm, there are some voices, many with unique perspectives, and some have taken the step a little further to suggest that conservation of natural areas and even the field of ecological restoration is kind of this hapless endeavor that we as a society need to move on from, and that it's a kind of fool's errand to conserve these remnant natural communities. But I'd like to touch upon a few of the logical fallacies of that. So one of the common critiques of restoration and natural areas conservation is that historical references are arbitrary. So if we look to prairies from pre-Euro-American settlement as our reference, why choose that time? Why choose 1491? Well, why don't we just go back to the Pleistocene? If we go back to the times of Pangaea, there were palm trees in what is now Alaska, so why not choose that? It's kind of a glib idea to me to make that criticism, because it's really conflating geologic timescales and ecological timescales. And our lives and the lifespans of species play out over ecological timescales. That's kind of akin to saying, well, we know there's going to be another Big Bang someday, so why worry about it? Well, I mean, those are, cosmic timescales. So this then suggests the entire notion of whether an organism is exotic or native is arbitrary if you think about it in geologic timescales. But in terms of maintaining biodiversity, it's very, very pertinent whether organisms are native or not. Another straw man argument is that natural area conservation is kind of this aesthetic, purist endeavor by those who believe that conservation of nature, that nature is pristine and separate from humans, as though it's this idealized screensaver. And I know this is a real place somewhere in the Indian Ocean, but it very much seems like a screensaver, this idealized, pristine area. But to think of that argument applied to tallgrass prairie is particularly absurd. The tallgrass prairie, as I've noted, is completely shaped by interaction with humans and always has. So anyone working with prairie conservation does not deny the important interrelation between humans and our environment. Similarly, conservation of high-quality natural areas is sometimes derided as this romanticized, nostalgic endeavor to reclaim paradise. Sometimes some of the hyperbole that's used would make it seem as though we're trying to rewild the prairie with unicorns and rainbows, but actually our efforts are much more grounded in reality and focused on the conservation of these plant communities. And lastly, the issue of invasive species. Some authors suggest that invasive species actually increase biodiversity. And by one definition, that's absolutely correct. An invasive species increases the number of species in a given region by one. We have one more species, right? So species richness has gone up. And although invasive species greatly contribute to the decline of rare plant species, you really can't pinpoint the extinction of any native species as being caused by invasive species. So if you look at it, that simple numbers game, an invasive species does increase invasive species richness. However, if we look at the scale of plant communities in which species actually interact, truly invasive species clearly lead to localized loss of biodiversity. And then some of these authors completely conflate the idea of exotic invasive species and I think project their own misunderstanding about that onto those who are actually doing natural areas conservation. Exotic is not the same as invasive, and land stewards know that. There are nearly 900 naturalized exotic species in Missouri, and yet only a very small portion of those would be considered invasive. My poster child for harmless exotic, not invasive, harmless exotic species would be Deptford pink. It's from the meadows of Deptford, England, originally. And it's pretty common. You see it even in higher quality prairies. Does it technically occupy some little bit of niche space that a native plant might otherwise grow in? Sure, just as throwing a grain of sand into the ocean technically makes sea level rise, but this plant is not disrupting the balance of our native plant communities or leading to the decline of any of our native species. And conservation practitioners are not focused on management of eliminating all exotic species, but only those that are truly, truly invasive. So in a sense, my prairie planting on my family farm there is a novel ecosystem. It's a man-made assemblage of prairie species, and it's in a location in which prairie probably didn't occur 500 years ago. And it's not free from exotic species. So natural areas managers realize that we must deal with some exotic species. We're not going to get rid of them all. We realize that we're in a changed, novel world, but that doesn't mean that we should abandon hope for conserving these really valuable remnant plant communities. And over 20 years, I've learned that since I first started researching this perfect recipe for cookbook recipe of how to make a prairie, that there is no such recipe, but with patience and effort, it is possible to greatly enhance the diversity of these low diversity warm season grasses, and that we can achieve much better results if we simply start with higher diversity seed mixes rather than 4 grasses in the start. I've also learned there's no recipe for putting prairie back together. Once an original prairie is lost, it is gone forever, but we will continue to conserve what remains and continue to learn how to make more authentic prairie restorations that support more biodiversity. And we need to continue these efforts to conserve the remaining ecologically intact remnants of the once tallgrass prairie ecosystem, not out of a sense of nostalgia, but because our imperiled grasslands and the threatened species they support are vibrant, vital, and they're teeming with life. So, thank you.
I'll come by the microphone if you have questions. We're videotaping, as you know, so we want to get the audio on the tape. So just raise your hands, I'll come by.
Covered a lot of ground there.
There's got to be a question.
I see some in the back.
Oh, I was looking in the wrong direction.
I was going back to where you came across the prairie where somebody just put out and killed everything in sight. And you said the people with those sites have to be approached diplomatically.
Yes.
When you were out there, did you speak to them? Did you say something to them? And is there follow-up, or how is that handled?
Yeah, so I did that work when I was working with the Kansas Biological Survey, and as I mentioned, we only did inventories of these remnant prairies with landowner permission. If we didn't get permission, we'd still map them and look through binoculars and make some cursory inventory. But the majority of the time, we did receive permission and would initiate some casual conversation with the landowners, and you begin to get a sense pretty quickly. There are some people who know exactly what they have and are doing everything they can to preserve it, and others who don't value that diversity as I might. But it's the starting point for a conservation. And it's really important not to come in and say, oh, I'm the academic with the state agency and I'm going to tell you what to do. That's pretty much a conversation starter. So just developing that relationship. And then we held some meetings in county seats and invited the landowners we'd worked with to some seminars in which we met with them and spoke about the importance of the land stewardship they're doing, starting with the point of that we're so appreciative that they have these remnants on their land and that they haven't plowed them. And we developed a hay meadow prairie landowners management guide at the Kansas Biological Survey, which we then distributed. And some were put in contact with the Kansas Land Trust, resulting in the conservation of these prairies. But some do continue to be lost, both to development or some misguided land management practice. But we certainly did follow through on speaking with those landowners and making those connections where we could, with some successes, importantly. Yes?
As you talked about conservation, you were talking about set-asides, essentially.
Yeah, Conservation Reserve Program.
And to the extent that so much of the what was tall grass prairie is now farmland, how do you try to envision how do you say, an expansion of conservation with economically viable ag sector?
Right. Yeah, that is a complex question. Well, I think we have an economically viable ag sector, certainly with modern agriculture. And this brings up it's a whole nother conversation, but the output per acre through modern agricultural practices is greatly increased, and some of the means that have been used to result in that high output are controversial with some. But if we look at that, also the fact that we're able to get more agricultural output per acre, if we didn't have that, if we were still getting the yields we were in the 1980s, we would need to have vastly more acreage to produce the amount of crops that we are. So that is an important part of the conservation puzzle, is to look at productive agriculture and blending that with setting aside land for conservation. And I think given the scale of the tall grass landscape, there is clearly room for both maintenance of and continued growth of productive agriculture, but also identifying spaces that are less optimal for agriculture, oftentimes which those more poor soils are oftentimes some of the most diverse prairies. So.
Any other questions? Yes.
That question could be a talk in its own right.
Would you discuss the appropriate way to deal with Sericea lespedeza, since it seems difficult to eradicate?
With dedication and with patience. So Sericea lespedeza is the most challenging, in my opinion, the most challenging invasive species in tallgrass prairie, at least in the southern Midwest, precisely because it can't be effectively managed with fire. Well-timed fire can keep it from going to seed in 1 year, but that timing of fire can't be repeated every year. If you do a growing season fire to keep Sericea from going to seed, you then don't have enough fuel for a burn the next year. So for a number of reasons, you can't manage it with fire. Fire does encourage recruitment of the next generation of seeds from the seed bank, which isn't to say that we shouldn't burn, but cutting to the chase, the only way to effectively control it is with some very specific herbicides that can be used, very targeted application, which if someone knows what they're doing, can do so without collateral damage to surrounding vegetation, and to keep it from going to seed, to kill the existing plants, to burn frequently, thus exhausting the seed bank, meaning encouraging the recruitment, because those seeds are going to come out of the seed bank. So we're trying to extirpate locally the Sericea, then we might as well get on with it and try to encourage them to germinate so that we can kill them. And then you need to keep that up for at least a decade. It's not the most encouraging news, but they're prolific seed producers, and realistically, in most sites, you're not going to completely eliminate it, but if you can reduce the abundance such that there are just small scattered patches, that you can do continued maintenance and keep it from completely taking over a prairie. The alternative of simply do nothing results in eventually a complete monoculture of Sericea lespedeza.
All right, there's time for one more question. Yes.
Do you see any examples in the United States or globally of the scientific community and the agricultural community and the ranching community coming together to do this conservation work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we see that in the U.S., perhaps even more than we realize. And I just think of some individuals I know who are large landholders who have highly productive properties from agricultural settings and ranching settings, and yet also are very dedicated to prairie conservation. So I really don't think that there is such a divisive camp of us versus them. I mean, there certainly are some instances in which individuals may not be aware of the best practices for management of our remnants, but that's simply a lack of education. There's a good amount of communication between the agricultural extension and rangeland production and prairie conservation. And the importance is to find middle ground. Certainly there are individuals who think of prairie conservation purely through the butterfly and plant diversity realm without thinking about the economic aspects, and individuals who think purely of economics without the conservation aspect. But there are a great number of people communicating and thinking about more balanced approaches to our land management.
Thank you, Quinn.
You're welcome.
This was wonderful.